Okay, good morning and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Nathan Dean. Again, welcome back to the Washington Policy Pulse. Apologize that we're doing this an hour earlier than normal. So if you're watching this set back on replay, we just unfortunately had to move some timing around, so we had to do it at 9 a.m. But going forward, we will go back to the 10 a.m. timeframe every Eastern, every Monday. I want to talk with some of the smaller stuff this week first, and then get into the larger stuff. So just in terms of the smaller stuff, over at the Senate, we have a little bit more in the way of confirmation hearings. Linda McMahon, who's going to be most likely confirmed as the next Department of Education Secretary, is up. And then now we're going to get into what I call the Tier 2 agency officials, like the deputy secretaries, undersecretaries, and also like Paul Atkins. We're hearing the chairman of the SEC nominee could get a nomination hearing sometime soon. So then we're going to move away from the first level cabinet and get into the agency leadership. That will start taking place over the next few weeks. But this week we've got Linda McMahon at the Department of Education going. We also have some CRA, Congressional Review Act work that's being done. These are markups. Over on the House side, if you remember, actually, let me back up. The Congressional Review Act, if you remember, is a resolution that allows the Congress to disapprove any regulation that has been finalized within the previous 60 legislative days. So essentially anything after August 7th, at this point, probably around August 15th, is at risk of being overturned via majority vote in the House, a majority vote in the Senate, and the president's signature. So what they're doing at the House at the moment is they're looking at 4 or 5 different energy-related regulations that came out from FERC and EPA over the last few days, last few months. The House is going to mark that up. They're going to probably have a vote on it in the next week or so, and then it would move over to the Senate. Over on the Senate side, at the House Financial Services Committee, they're looking at the CFPB's overdraft lending rules. So, again, this was anticipated. Any regulation that was finalized within the 11th hour of the Biden administration was at risk of this. So, don't be surprised if you see a headline in the next 2 to 3 weeks that several of these regulations have been disapproved. And as a reminder, once Congress does the Congressional Review Act, a future Democratic agency can't just go back and say, okay, we're going to be going back to it. You have to materially change the rule. You have to materially change the writing. And so these rules are effectively dead for the next few years. So what else is going on this week? Obviously, a lot of stuff. So today, March 3rd, March 4th is the date that the Canada and Mexico tariffs are coming into effect, according to President Trump. We're telling our clients right now, just hold back a little bit on this. We're saying about a 60% chance these tariffs move forward. The reason for the hesitation is that on Friday afternoon, Scott Bessent, there were a couple of headlines, and he actually appeared on Bloomberg TV talking about this. Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, started floating this idea that Canada and Mexico could put tariffs on China, and they could create what is a fortress. I almost said fortress of solitude because I was watching Superman this weekend, but they would put this fortress on Chinese tariffs coming into the United States. And so this is one of those things where, when you see these statements and you saw the negotiations take place over the weekend, it still gives us kind of this thought that maybe these tariffs are going to not happen. So we'll see. But obviously, President Trump is the one that ultimately makes the call. So he's going to have to look at that. But we're going to have plenty of stuff out on the terminal. If this does happen, we're going to have plenty of research out on the terminal, both on Canada and Mexico on Wednesday morning. Also coming up, State of the Union is tomorrow night. So State of the Union, I can't front run our preview. That's coming out tomorrow. I can't front run that. But what I can tell you is a couple of high level thoughts. When it comes to State of the Unions, the first one after an election, and this is for both Republicans and Democrats, the first State of the Union after an election isn't exactly a speech that usually tries to call on the American people to support your agenda. Usually it's more of a campaign style speech because most presidents will believe, hey, look, just 3 months ago, in this President Trump's case, 77 million Americans voted for me. As a result, I'm going to continue to push forward a lot of the campaign style and the campaign promises that I was saying in terms of like, hey, I said I was going to cut stuff. Here's Doge. I was going to get us to end the war with Ukraine. I'm going to talk about that. But potential subject areas that are going to come up: Ukraine, obviously tax reform. You'll see comments on immigration. You'll see comments on maybe potentially calling for the Inflation Reduction Act. You'll see comments on deregulation. And so you're going to see a lot of stuff, but I don't think you're going to see much in the way of new information. I think it's going to be a rehash of what President Trump said in his campaign style, and then he's going to just continue for the implementation and the execution of those goals. But we're going to have our preview out, and if anything exciting happens, you can always ping us on Wednesday, and we can talk about that as well. Um, just real quick on Ukraine, I don't cover Ukraine, so I can't really talk much about Friday. My colleagues over at Bloomberg Economics have a piece out on what happened on Friday in the Oval Office, but I would just summarize some of the Bloomberg News reporting that's been coming out at the moment. Is that President Trump wants an apology from President Zelensky. President Zelensky has said that he's willing to come back to the United States to do a deal over minerals. Looks like the UK Prime Minister and the President of France had calls with both Trump and Zelensky over the weekend. So there are negotiations to try and bring back the parties to the table in terms of signing this minerals deal. And the minerals deal would obviously give the United States access to certain rare earth minerals in exchange for certain guarantees, or just the idea that the incentive would keep the United States certainly interested in keeping Ukraine's security at stake. So, but again, I don't really talk about that. So if you do have in-depth questions, I can put you in touch with them and so forth. So the last two things I want to talk about is first, the government shutdown. So the government shutdown is earmarked for March 14th. This is when Congress, on a bipartisan nature, remember, this has to be bipartisan, which is why there's a shutdown threat. Now, the general thought here is that if the Republicans offer a clean CR, meaning that they are going to say, right, we're going to fund the government until September with no strings attached, it's going to be very difficult for Democrats to say no to that. If the Republicans move forward and they say, here's a deal in which includes like codifying Doge cuts or other types of policy riders, then the Democrats will feel much more emboldened to say no to that. And then you have a shutdown. Now, there's a decent chance that we could have a shutdown, but it really depends on what the Republicans do. If the Republicans offer a clean CR, I don't think a shutdown happens. If the Republicans offer a CR that includes a lot of these policy goals, then I think a shutdown happens. But from the market perspective, just remember is that shutdowns don't impact markets all that much. Even the 31-day shutdown that President Trump had in his first term, markets actually declined and then they went back up. And then secondly, even for defense contractors, a lot of these contracts, unless assuming that they're still going, are 18 months, 2 years, 3 years in nature. And so a 2-week shutdown isn't going to really change things all that much. So I'll have a little bit more on the shutdown coming out later this week. So if you want to talk about that, also, we are happy to do that. And then the last thing I want to talk about is the budget resolution, this idea of tax reform. So last week, the House of Representatives passed a resolution, and these were blueprints for the instructions for extending the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. I didn't think they were going to be able to do it on Tuesday night. I thought it was going to take them until Thursday. Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, got all of the members of the Republican caucus together to agree to this. Now, what did they agree to? So they agreed to a set of instructions that then goes out to various committees to try and come up with the specifics of how to pay for these tax cuts. As a reminder, to extend the Trump era tax cuts, it's going to cost around $4.5 trillion. Now, there was a little bit of misinformation going around. I saw Representative Boebert, for example, tweet out that, the House of Representatives just passed no taxes on tips. That's not exactly what happened. There was a blueprint, and there was nothing on taxes on tips within that blueprint. Now, what the instruction said is that in order to pay for the $4.5 trillion worth of tax cuts, the House committees, the 8 House committees, would have to come up with around $2 trillion in terms of cuts. And the rest of it, I presume, would be economic growth, tariffs, that would then get closer to that $4 trillion number. Now, the $2 trillion cuts, this is where you've seen a lot of people talk about Medicaid and SNAP benefits. And this is where the challenge is, because there are not going to be enough Republicans, in my view, that would support cutting Medicaid to the point of what they were looking for in these instructions. Senator Hawley, a very conservative Republican from Missouri, has already started speaking against this because Missouri has a high populace that has Medicaid benefits as a result. In fact, I saw a piece the other day that Speaker Johnson actually has the 5th district in terms of number of Medicaid recipients. So it's going to be very difficult for Republicans to come to an agreement on this. However, there is also talk at the same time, and this is what came out over the weekend, that Senate Republicans are discussing this idea of changing the baseline. So if the Trump tax cuts cost $4.5 trillion, that's based on the idea that you have to make this budget neutral. But the Senate Republican idea is essentially saying, instead of paying for $4.5 trillion, let's just use the 2017 tax cuts as current policy, and therefore we don't have to pay $4.5 trillion. You just don't have to pay anything because it is the current policy of the United States. Now, this isn't exactly how resolutions or reconciliation has worked in the past. The Senate parliamentarian is the one that actually signs off on this, and the Republicans can always just get rid of the Senate parliamentarian and get a new one. But there are going to be some folks in the Senate that aren't entirely thrilled with this idea because you essentially said, look, we don't have to cut anything. We can just, keep it at zero and then just pass it and we're good. The other challenge that's going to come up in terms of the deficit. Now, a lot of clients have asked me like, well, what about the CBO score? What about this? What about this? When it comes to reconciliation, I can get you economic analyses that say that the deficit's going to do this. I can get you economic analyses saying economic growth is going to do that. But the political reality is something that I point to because there will be a belief that if the current baseline is zero, then the deficit is going to increase as a result. And the Republicans right now can only afford to lose one member, and there are probably 30 members of the House of Representatives that are not going to vote for a deficit increasing bill to that magnitude. And so the political realities may actually stop the current baseline. It can happen. We'll see what happens as the negotiations take place. The political realities may actually stop the baseline. So stay tuned on that. I think if you were to give the House of Representatives Republicans truth serum, they would say their preference is not to go forth and make these, to do it as current baseline. But remember, President Trump has said he wants to make these permanent, but he's also said he doesn't want to touch Medicare. And with those two realities that President Trump has said, then moving it to current baseline may be the only way the Republicans can move forward. But again, if you've heard me talk about budget resolutions before in reconciliation, you know that I have said that we're not going to find out until the fourth quarter what actually happens here, and that's still the case. So I'm going to pause there. There's a lot of stuff happening this week. I want to say thank you very much for attending. I apologize again that we're 1 hour early. Next week, we'll be going back to the 10 a.m., 3 p.m., 4 p.m. in Europe. So next week, we'll be back at the 10 a.m. site time frame. But again, thank you very much for attending. We really appreciate it, and have a great week.